We have followed the journey of the Israelites as Moses had led them out of Egypt through the wilderness and to the verge of entry into the land of Canaan, the land that God had promised to give to the descendants of Abraham. It's a journey that has taken them 40 years and it's cost the lives of a whole generation. But there remains a couple of things to happen before the Israelites finally cross the River Jordan and enter the land under the leadership of Joshua. And that is Moses' farewell address to the people and his death. And this is what the book of Deuteronomy records for us. So this evening we'll be spending our time in the book of Deuteronomy looking at these final events. The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth book in our Bibles, and the first five books are often referred to collectively as the law or the law of Moses, the Torah, which is the Hebrew word for law or instruction, or the Pentateuch. Pentateuch is a word that means the five rolls or the five books. And the Bible attributes all five books to the work of Moses. He's regarded as the primary author of these books, although there may have been some later editorial work to put them into the form in which we have them today. So we want to have a look at the context here for the book of Deuteronomy. We have, of course, beginning with the book of Genesis, the account of God's creation of the world and the universe. We have the story of Adam and Eve and the introduction of sin into the world. Noah and the flood. We have God's choice of Abraham and his promise to give to Abraham many descendants and to give them a land to live in, which would be the land of Canaan. And the book of Genesis ends with the settlement of Jacob, Abraham's grandson, and his family in the land of Egypt. And so at this point, the promise of the land is not yet fulfilled. The book of Exodus then takes up the story with Jacob's descendants, the Israelites in Egypt, who've now grown vastly in number, but they're in slavery. They're oppressed by the Egyptians. And so God chooses Moses to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. We have Pharaoh's reluctance to let them go, and so God's judgment coming upon Egypt in the form of the 10 plagues. We have the Exodus as the people leave Egypt and the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea, the arrival at Mount Sinai and the making of the covenant between God and Israel. So the giving of the law and the building of the tabernacle takes place there. So the promise that God makes to the people that he will lead them to the land. The book of Leviticus fits into that time when the people were at Sinai. And this is really a handbook of instructions to the priests. The priests were from the tribe of Levi, hence the title Leviticus. So it concerns their role in worship and sacrifice. So there's very little in the book of Leviticus which provides sort of a historical narrative of events taking place. It's more to do with instructions concerning the sacrifices and the worship, and particularly an emphasis upon the importance of holiness. And then, as we've seen just recently, the book of Numbers picks up the journey of the Israelites as they leave Mount Sinai and they end up on the plains of Moab, just across the Jordan. So covering a period of 40 years here, the time when the Israelites were in the wilderness waiting for that generation to die out before the new generation would enter the land. So the fulfillment of the land promise is now imminent. Well, the fifth book now is entitled Deuteronomy. And the name of the book in our Bibles, Deuteronomy, means second law or repetition of the law. The name comes from the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures known as the Septuagint, in which the book is entitled Deuteronomion. And this comes from a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 18, from the Septuagint version, where the phrase second law is used in that verse. It's giving instructions concerning the king and what he was to make a copy of the law. So in our versions, it's usually translated as a copy of the law. So it wasn't a second law in the sense that it was different to the first, but it's a copy of the law that God gave at Mount Sinai. So it's called the second law then, or Deuteronomy, because Moses really repeats much of the law that was given 40 years earlier at Mount Sinai. For example, in Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 to 17, we have the record there of the Ten Commandments given at Sinai, which Moses repeats here in Deuteronomy when he speaks to the people in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 6 to 21. So Moses is in the book of Deuteronomy is really repeating the law and renewing the covenant for a new generation, since the generation who were alive when the law was first given at Mount Sinai are now all dead. In the Hebrew Bible, though, the book is called Devarim, which means the words, and the title being taken from the opening words of the book, which chapter 1, verse 1 simply begins, "These are the words." So that's where the Hebrew title of the book comes from. And that was the Jewish practice was they weren't very imaginative in the names they gave to their books. They just took the first word or couple of words from the book, and that was the title of the book. So the book of Deuteronomy is really a compilation of 3 speeches made by Moses to the people of Israel whilst they are encamped on the plains of Moab. So that's how the book begins in chapter 1 and verse 1. "These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness," and goes on to give the locations there. And it's then followed by an account of the events leading up to the death of Moses. So the 3 speeches or addresses made by Moses to the people are recorded in chapters 1 to 30. The first speech, the first address in chapter 1, from verse 1 through to chapter 4, verse 43, is really an historical review of God's dealings with Israel. So here Moses is recalling all of the things that God has done for Israel in bringing them out of Egypt. He's recalling the history of that time when they were in the wilderness up to that point. His second speech in a longer section from the end of chapter 4 through to chapter 26 is an exposition of the laws and an exhortation for the people to love God and to keep his law. So this is really the repetition of those laws that God had given earlier being given to this new generation. He's telling them these are the laws that will apply when you get into the land. Of particular note in that section there is chapter 6, verses 4 to 8, which is a well-known passage which Jesus quotes in the New Testament. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And these words which I command you this day shall be upon your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. And you shall bind them as a sign upon your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes, and you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gate." So an important passage of scripture there for Israel. The third speech, the third address, is from chapter 27 through to chapter 30. And this is setting out the consequences of obedience or disobedience. That if the people do obey the laws that Moses has just been encouraging them to do, they will be blessed. And the list there is of the blessings that they will receive. If, however, they are disobedient, then they will experience the curses that are set out there. Then in the closing chapters of the book, the second section, chapters 31 to 34, we have the closing words of Moses and the final events leading up to his death. So we have the final charges that Moses makes to the people to give them encouragement. We have the Song of Moses in chapter 32. We have the prediction of Moses' death at the end of chapter 32, and then Moses giving a final blessing on the tribes of Israel in chapter 33. And then in the final chapter, chapter 34, is the account of the death and the burial of Moses. So this evening we're going to concentrate looking at these final few chapters. The book of Deuteronomy is well worth studying in its own right, and perhaps at some point in the future we might do that. But this evening we want to concentrate on these final few chapters. So in chapter 31, Moses begins here by encouraging the people and Joshua to go into the land in verses 1 to 8. God will be with them and God will give them success. They are to be strong and of good courage. They are not to be afraid, because the Lord will be with them and will not fail them or forsake them. So words of encouragement there for the people. Then in verses 9 to 15, we see that Moses wrote the law and he gave it to the priests. Chapter 31, verse 9, Moses wrote this law and gave it to the priests, sons of Levi, who carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. So Moses had written this down, and now he entrusts it to the priests. And here he gives the instruction that every 7 years, at the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, all of the people of Israel were to assemble together to hear the law being read to them by the priests. So everyone would come in an assembly and they would listen to the law being read. And they were to learn to fear the Lord and to do all of the words of the law. And their children who have not known the law were also to hear it and to learn to fear the Lord. Well, in verses 14 to 23, the Lord then summoned Moses and Joshua to come to the tent of meeting, and the Lord appeared to them in a pillar of fire. So verse 14, Deuteronomy 31 says, And the Lord said to Moses, Behold, the days approach when you must die. Call Joshua and present yourselves in the tent of meeting, that I may commission him. And Moses and Joshua went and presented themselves in the tent of meeting, and the Lord appeared in the tent in a pillar of cloud, and the pillar of cloud stood by the door of the tent. So the Lord here warns that after the death of Moses, the people will turn away from the Lord, and they will break the covenant by going after other gods. And the Lord will be angry with them, and he will hide his face from them. So Moses is instructed here to write a song and to teach it to the people so that it will be a witness for God against the people. So verse 19 here says, God says to Moses, Now therefore write this song and teach it to the people of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the people of Israel. And we'll see the song in chapter 32. So the Lord then commissioned Joshua in verse 23 by saying to him, Be strong and of good courage, for you shall bring the children of Israel into the land which I swore to give them. I will be with you. And then verses 24 to 31, the conclusion of the chapter here is a warning to the Levites that when Moses had finished writing the book of the law, he commanded the Levites to put this copy of the law by the side of the Ark of the Covenant as a witness against them. And he knows how rebellious and stubborn they have been whilst he has been alive, and again warns that they will become even more so after his death. The leaders of the tribes are assembled here to hear Moses warn them that after his death they will act corruptly and they will turn aside from what he has commanded them, and consequently they will suffer for that. Evil will come upon them. So in chapter 32, then we have this song of Moses, which God has instructed him to write. It's introduced in verse 30, the final verse of chapter 31. Then Moses spoke the words of this song until they were finished in the ears of all the assembly of Israel. And it's well worth taking the time to read through this song if you have an opportunity to do that. So Moses spoke the words of the song to the assembly of Israel, and the song recalls the faithfulness of God. God is called the rock in verse 4. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and right is he. Uh, Verses 10 to 14 there show how God has shown kindness and goodness to Israel. So again, it's recalling those events that have happened in the past, God's care for Israel. Verse 10 says, He found him in a desert land and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him, he cared for him, he kept him as the apple of his eye. The picture there of the preciousness of Israel, the apple of his eye. And then this wonderful picture in verse 11, like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. The Lord alone did lead him, and there was no foreign God with him. So the picture of God being like this mother eagle that cares for its young when they're coming out of the nest and supporting them on its wings. So the description there of that care and goodness that God has shown towards them. However, the people of Israel have rejected God and they have become unfaithful, turning to idolatry. As verse 15 says there, but Jeshurun is a name that is used of Israel here, waxed fat and kicked. You waxed fat, you grew thick, you became sleek. Then he forsook God who made him and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods, with abominable practices. They provoked him to anger. So God's judgment then will come upon his people because of this. However, God will continue to show mercy and compassion towards them, and he will save them from their enemies. So Moses recited the words of this song to the people. At the end here, verse 44 of Deuteronomy 32, we're told that Moses came and recited all the words of this song in the hearing of the people, he and Joshua the son of Nun. And when Moses had finished speaking all these words to Israel, he said to them, lay to heart all the words which I enjoin upon you this day, that you may command them to your children, that they may be careful to do all the words of this law. For this is no trifle for you, but it is your life, and thereby you shall live long in the land which you are going over the Jordan to possess. So Moses encourages the people to learn this song and to obey his words and to teach these things to their children. And if the people can remember the words of the song, then they will be able to remember what it is that Moses has been teaching them. So the song is really a device to aid their memory. And we can perhaps identify with that. Sometimes it's easy to remember the words of a song, and when we remember the words of the song, we remember what it is that we're teaching. Like when singing, if we want to recall the names of the books of the Bible, we perhaps are familiar with the song which mentions all the books of the Bible, and we perhaps sing that to ourselves to aid our memory. So this is the purpose of this song. It's a memory aid, so that the people will remember the things that Moses has taught them. And Moses tells them, this is no trivial matter. This is your life. And by obeying these things, God promises that long life in the land. Well, we come in chapter 32, the final verses, verse 48 to 52 of the prediction of Moses' death. So here, the Lord now instructs Moses to ascend Mount Nebo and to view the land of Canaan that God is giving to the people. And then Moses will die on that mountain. You can see on the little map there the location of Mount Nebo. But of course, because of his own sin, then Moses is not to enter the land himself. He's not allowed to go in, but God does allow him to see it. And in chapter 33, we have a final blessing on Israel. So before his death, Moses blessed the people of Israel. And the blessing in chapter 33 begins by acknowledging what God has done for his people. This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. He said, "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came from the 10,000s of holy ones with flaming fire at his right hand. Yea, he loved his people. All those consecrated to him were in his hand. So they followed in thy steps, receiving direction from thee, when Moses commanded us a law as a possession for the assembly of Jacob. Thus the Lord became king in Jeshurun, when the heads of the people were gathered, all the tribes of Israel together." So this blessing begins by acknowledging the good things that God has done for his people, and then there follows these individual blessings for each of the tribes, which go from verse 6 down to verse 25. So we have in verse 6 the blessing on Reuben, let Reuben live and not die, nor let his men be few. In verse 7, Judah, this he said of Judah. Verse 8 is Levi, tribe of Levi, which is a longer blessing there for them down to verse 11. Verse 12 is Benjamin, and then Joseph in verse 13. 13 to 17, Joseph is divided into Ephraim and the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, mentioned there at verse 17, and then Zebulun and Issachar, Gad, Dan in verse 22, Naphtali in 23, Asher in verse 24. And into 25 there. And then the blessing, again, it concludes with a further acknowledgement of what the Lord has done for Israel. So it ends in a similar way to the way in which it began. So there is none like God, O Jeshurun, who rides through the heavens to your help, and in his majesty through the skies. The eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. And he thrust out the enemy before you and said, Destroy. So Israel dwelt in safety, the fountain of Jacob alone, in a land of grain and wine. Yea, his heavens dropped down dew. Happy are you, O Israel. Who is like you, a people saved by the Lord, the shield of your help, and the sword of your triumph? Your enemies shall come fawning to you, and you shall tread upon their high places. So again, we've not taken the time to read the whole of the chapter here, but again, it's worth reading the blessings there on the different tribes. So chapter 34 is the death and the burial of Moses here. So Moses went up to Mount Nebo as God had commanded him to do so, and from there the Lord showed him all of the land. So verse 1 of chapter 34 begins, "And Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him all the land." And then there's a description there of the boundaries, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea being the Mediterranean, the Negeb, which is the desert area to the south, and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, I will give to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go over there. So Moses has gone up the mountain there. The Lord has shown him the extent of the land, that this is the land that the Lord had sworn to give to the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the Lord let Moses see the land, but he's not allowed to go over and enter the land. Moses, who's described again here as being the servant of the Lord in verse 5, died there in the land of Moab. And verse 6 says that he was buried in the valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no man knows the place of his burial to this day. So verse 5 there says, So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord, and he buried him in the valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no man knows the place of his burial to this day. But there's no known grave, no grave for anyone to be able to go and visit. And Moses, we learn, was 120 years old when he died. In verse 7 there, Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. His eye was not dim, his natural strength had not declined. So Moses did not die of old age, he did not die of ill health, but God had arranged this. This was in accordance with God. God chose the time when Moses should die. And the people, we're told, wept for Moses for 30 days there in the plains of Moab. And that's the same length of time that they had wept for his brother Aaron when he died. Joshua, being full of the spirit of wisdom as a result of the laying on of Moses' hands, now assumed the leadership of the people. The book of Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 and 2 begins in this way. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' minister, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land which I am giving to them, to the people of Israel. So Moses may be dead, but the work of God must carry on. And Joshua is the one to carry on that work. And Joshua is, we're told here, being full of the spirit of wisdom. So he was equipped to do this. And the people obeyed him, and they did as the Lord commanded. The book of Deuteronomy then concludes with this tribute to Moses in verses 10 to 12. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him for all the signs and the wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants, and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great and terrible deeds which Moses wrought in the sight of all Israel. So Moses was unique amongst God's prophets, that there was none like him, we're told here, whom the Lord knew face to face. So what are we to make then of this man, Moses? We've spent a lot of time with him over the past months. Moses is one of the great characters of the Bible. From his birth through to his death, he lived a remarkable life in a remarkable relationship with God, as we see there in those closing verses, that we're told that there was none like him for all of the signs and wonders which the Lord sent him to do. Then also in the book of Numbers, in chapter 12, verses 6 to 8, we see his special relationship that he had with God here. This is when Miriam and Aaron had tried to oppose Moses and to suggest that they were on the same level as him. But the Lord said to them, hear my words, if there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision, I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses, he is entrusted with all my house, With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in dark speech, and he beholds the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? So God defending Moses' reputation there and says, I speak with him mouth to mouth, not as God had spoken to other prophets. So Moses was in that unique relationship with God. It was Moses' desire to know God, to obey God, and to do that which was pleasing to God. That was his life. And it must have been clear, really, from his birth that God had a special purpose for his life. For he was saved from death as a baby, brought up in the Egyptian court by Pharaoh's daughter. Moses was a leader. He was a servant. He was a miracle worker. He was a prophet. He was a writer. He was a judge. He was an administrator. And his name became synonymous with the law itself, so that when the law is being read or quoted, we're told that it is Moses who is being read. So in Luke chapter 24 and verse 27, when Jesus is talking to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus and explaining to them what the scriptures have said about him, we're told that, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So Luke simply says there, beginning with Moses, meaning the law, the first 5 books, beginning with Moses and all the prophets. And then in verse 44 of Luke chapter 24 as well, Jesus himself there says to his disciples, these are my words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Then in John chapter 5, verses 45 and 46, Jesus again is the speaker here, and been in discussion with those who are in disagreement with him. He says to them here, do not think that I shall accuse you to the Father. It is Moses who accuses you, on whom you set your hope. If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote of me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my word? So Jesus there again simply uses the name Moses to refer to the things that Moses had written there in the law. If you believed Moses, if you believed what Moses had written, you would believe me as well, he says. Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 15 as well uses simply the name Moses again, speaking of the Jews who holding on to the old covenant and have that veil still staying over their minds. He says, yet, yes, to this day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their minds. Again, referring to the law there as simply as Moses, whenever Moses is read. So Moses' name is synonymous with the law itself. Stephen, in his speech in Acts chapter 7 and verse 44, speaks there of Moses having received living oracles to give to us. So Acts 7 verse 40, verse 44. No, sorry, not verse 44, verse 38. Acts 7, verse 38. This is he, referring to Moses, this is he who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai and with our fathers, and he received living oracles to give to us. So Moses there received living oracles, received the word of God, which he then passed on to others. Stephen says that he gave to us. Moses is, of course, often mentioned in the New Testament, and much of that speech of Stephen's there in Acts chapter 7 is taken up by recalling the events of the life of Moses So from Acts chapter 7, verse 20 down to verse 44, Stephen recalls um, the life of Moses here, beginning with his birth. At this time, Moses was born and was beautiful before God. And he divides Moses' life of 120 years into three 40-year sections or periods. So the first 40 years Moses spent in Egypt from his birth to the time when he was 40 years old. Verse 23 of Acts 7 says, when he was 40 years old, and this recalling here, after his problem with killing the Egyptian, he had to flee Egypt. So he went to the land of Midian, where he worked as a shepherd for the second period of 40 years. And then in verse 30, Stephen says, now when 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in a flame of fire in a bush. So that marks the beginning of the third period of 40 years, when Moses is called by God at the burning bush and called to go and lead Israel out of Egypt. So his 120 years can that's conveniently be divided into those three 40-year periods. The writer of the letter to the Hebrews points to the example of Moses' faith in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 23 to 28. He says, by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid for 3 months by his parents because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to share ill treatment with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered abuse suffered for the Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. By faith the people crossed the Red Sea as if on dry land, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. So the writer picking up there on a number of those events from Moses' life and seeing them as an example of his faith. However, of course, Moses was not perfect, and the Bible never hides the fact that its leading characters had their weaknesses and they were sinners just like the rest of us. Moses made some mistakes. He murdered an Egyptian. At first, he was reluctant to do what God asked him to do in leading the people of Israel out of Egypt. He made all of those excuses as to why he shouldn't go and do that job. He became angry and frustrated with the people when they constantly complained about conditions in the wilderness and when they turned to idolatry. And he committed a sin which prevented him from entering the promised land, something that must have been a cause of great sorrow and disappointment to him. And we see in Deuteronomy chapter 3 that he appealed to God, that God might change his mind and let him go into the land. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 23, Moses, speaking to the people here, says to them, and I besought the Lord at that time, saying, O Lord God, thou hast only begun to show thy servant thy greatness and thy mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth who can do such works and mighty acts as thine? Let me go over, I pray, and see the good land beyond the Jordan, that goodly hill country and Lebanon. But the Lord was angry with me on your account, and would not hearken to me. And the Lord said to me, let it suffice you, speak no more to me of this matter. Go up to the top of Pisgah and lift up your eyes westward and northward and southward and eastward, and behold it with your eyes, for you shall not go over this Jordan. So Moses had even tried to appeal to God to let him go into the land, but God said, don't talk to me about this any longer. You can see the land, but you're not to go into it. Nevertheless, Moses was a compassionate and caring man, interceding on behalf of the people a number of times when God was ready to destroy them completely, offering to have his own name blotted out of God's book if only the people could be forgiven and saved, as we see in Exodus chapter 32 and verse 32. But now if thou wilt forgive their sin, and if not, blot me, I pray thee, out of thy book, which thou hast written. So he offers to forego his own salvation if only God would forgive his people, the Israelites. As a prophet, Moses is seen as a type or a forerunner of Christ himself. In Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 15, Deuteronomy 18 verse 15, Moses says again, it's part of this speech to the people, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brethren, him you shall heed. And Moses saying there that a prophet like him would be raised up by the Lord, and you will listen to him. And then the word of God himself in verse 18, God says, I will raise up for them a prophet like you, like Moses, from among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And that verse is quoted in Acts chapter 3 and verse 18 to 24, and it's applied to Christ here as this prophet like Moses, who would be God would raise up, of course, being Jesus himself. Acts chapter 3 and verse 18. These are the words of Peter. Peter is the speaker here. Telling the people, but what God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets, that his Christ should suffer, he thus fulfilled. Repent therefore and turn again, that your sins may be blotted out, that times of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord, and that he may send the Christ appointed for you, Jesus, whom heaven must receive until the time for establishing all that God spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from of old. Moses said, the Lord God will raise up for you a prophet from your brethren as he raised me up. You shall listen to him in whatever he tells you. And it shall be that every soul that does not listen to that prophet shall be destroyed from the people. So the quotation there that Peter gives is from those words from Deuteronomy chapter 18 of this prophet whom God would raise up. And then from Stephen's speech as well in Acts chapter 7 and verse 37, Stephen also quotes this verse, referring again to Moses. This is the Moses who said to the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet from your brethren as he raised me up. And Jesus is the fulfillment of that. But however great Moses was, however highly regarded he was, it is Christ who is greater. Again, the writer to the Hebrews shows us this in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, where he draws this comparison between Moses and Jesus. Therefore, holy brethren, who share in a heavenly call, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession. He was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in God's house. Yet Jesus has been counted worthy of as much more glory than Moses, as the builder of a house has more honor than the house. For every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But Christ was faithful over God's house as a son, and we are his house, if we hold fast our confidence and pride in our hope. The writer sees both the being faithful, but Moses was faithful in God's house as a servant, but Christ was faithful over God's house as a son, and therefore worthy of greater glory. Moses' final appearance in the Bible is not in the book of Deuteronomy, but it is in the New Testament accounts of the transfiguration of Jesus on the mountain, when Moses and Elijah appeared with Jesus and were talking to him. Matthew records this in Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 to 3, Mark in chapter 9, verses 2 to 4, and Luke in chapter 9, verses 28 to 31. And we'll read Luke's account here. Luke 9, verse 28. Now about 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his countenance was altered, and his raiment became dazzling white. And behold, two men talked with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was to accomplish at Jerusalem. And Luke tells us there that they were talking with Jesus about his departure. And the word that Luke uses, which is translated as departure there, is the Greek word exodus. So here's another exodus that is soon to take place when Jesus goes to Jerusalem. And so we see that finally Moses did stand in that promised land. He had to wait a long time, and it was there on the Mount of Transfiguration that he is present with Jesus. So there is much for us to learn, much for us to appreciate from the life of Moses. He is this great servant of God and of God's people.